Let's begin. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Jill Newberg, Head of Go-to-Market for our EHS Intelligence Business Unit here within HISA. And welcome to our webinar, Building a Business Case for Confident Compliance. We are very excited to be joined today by EHS Industry Analyst with Verdantix, Zain Idris, and we'll do a proper introduction in a moment. First, some housekeeping slides. In the next slide, you'll see that all of our attendees are in listen-only mode on mute, but please use the Q&A window in your console and enter in any questions you may have that you'd like our panelists to answer. We'll do our best to answer them during the Q&A session at the end of this webinar, but if we don't get to your question today, we'll reach out soon with an answer. Please note that we're recording today's session and it will be sent to you in the next couple of days to re-watch. Next, let me introduce our speakers. On the next slide, you will see we're so grateful to be joined today by Zain Idris, EHS Industry Analyst with Verdantix. Zain specializes in EHS digital strategy and corporate spending trends. His research that he'll share today examines how firms are positioning their EHS budgets, considering shifts in investment priorities, the development of key functional modules, and emerging technologies of interest. Zain's insights support EHS decision makers in benchmarking their strategies against global peers and navigating critical considerations around digital transformation. Zain holds a Bachelor of Science in Economics from the University of Warwick. And we're joined today by our own Mary Foley, Expert Services Strategy Senior Director here within HISA. Mary has more than 25 years of experience in strategy and risk. She's currently a Forbes contributor in their money and investing section. Mary's been a part of the HISA team since 2020 and worked initially with its forerunner, first established over 25 years ago. Thank you both again for joining, and we're so looking forward to hearing your insights. On the next slide, I'm just going to give a quick introduction to HISA before we begin. HISA offers solutions and services that help companies run safer operations, make safer products, use safer chemicals, and uphold their sustainability commitments. In the next slide, you'll see that we provide regulatory and chemical intelligence, authored and supported by our expert team of over 160 legal analysts, and powered by our innovative AI-enabled software solutions. How we do it is in the next slide, which covers our solutions from products, operations, substances, and sustainability, including our comprehensive coverage of regulatory requirements and future-looking trends, chemical and substance intelligence that extends throughout our customers' supply chains, our professional development events and webinars, our global coverage, and on the EHS side, that's over 400 jurisdictions worldwide, and of course, our expert services team offering to implement, support, and team up with our customers to address their unique compliance and sustainability challenges. In the next slide, you'll see that HISA supports the world's leading global brands to transform the hard work of managing enterprise compliance into a competitive advantage, realizing measurable ROI through better decision-making with fast access to compliance and sustainability intelligence, proactive mitigation of the regulatory, financial, and reputational risks that can accompany non-compliance findings, and finally, the optimization of their resources throughout the company, compliance and beyond, to streamline the work of enterprise teams with faster access to timely, accurate compliance data that they need. Who are we as a company? In the next slide, you'll see we're about 500 employees strong with over 160 regulatory analysts covering a global footprint of many local offices, 3 continents, and fluency in 35 local languages. Like we said, we've been doing business for about 30 years and have coverage in over 400 jurisdictions. And without any more ado, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Mary Foley, our Expert Services Strategy Director. Mary?
That's great. Thanks a million for that, Jill. So as Jill mentioned, we're delighted to have Zain from Verdantix join us today to share not only his thoughts on building a business case for compliance, but also sharing the findings from the Verdantix 2025 EHS Global Corporate Survey. And later on, Jill herself will share a summary of the findings from our own independent client survey. So plenty of information to follow. And what a topical subject we have for you today. As we're all very well aware, EHS, and for that matter, sustainability and ESG budgets are currently coming under scrutiny as probably never before. We are navigating a period of deep regulatory uncertainty and geopolitical upheavals. As we only have an hour today, and I don't want to eat too much into Zane's time, suffice it to say that an in-depth examination of themes such as competitiveness and anti-competitiveness, perceived barriers to trade, simplification, deregulation, and the role of AI, we could cover a month's worth of discussions. However, for today's purposes, let's just set the scene. What we do know is that this regulatory uncertainty, allied with tariff turbulence, supply chain disruption, and global instability, are all putting more and more pressure on how companies can best meet their stakeholder needs. So starting with an inside outlook, we are increasingly hearing that EHS and sustainability ESG teams are being asked to do a lot more with the same resources, or in quite a few cases, even less resources. So efficiency is definitely the watchword of the moment. So questions currently being asked of EHS functions include, if regulations are being revised or rolled back, does that mean enforcement becomes even less of an issue, and do we need to reprioritize? So the next slide just gives a little bit of an overview of what we're seeing in the regulatory world. And actually what we're seeing is that the opposite is true. Instead of simplification, it seems that the regulatory landscape is becoming even more complicated. With the uncertainty surrounding major regulations, such as in Europe, the potential omnibus impacts on CSRD and CSDDD, and yet another regulation, the EUDR, looks like it's going to be delayed by yet another year. In the US, we're seeing the rollback of large numbers of federal regulations and the predicted upsurge in state-level legislation, California being the classic example. And in Asia-Pac, with the focus on regulations related to chemicals, climate change, and circular economy, it is becoming more apparent that there will be more numerous and fragmented regulations across the globe. So for more companies with global operations and product markets to be thinking about. So we're also hearing that the regulatory playing field is becoming less level for companies, their peers, and their competitors. However, it is evident that in addition to regulatory drivers, the market and investors are also playing their part. We can see this in the rise in numbers of jurisdictions voluntarily adopting the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. 31 jurisdictions are now in various stages of development of implementing the requirements of these standards, and we know that IFRS has always stated that they are driven by investor needs. Markets and investors will always need to be able to make decisions on a company's standing, and this is where we see that compliance and evidence of this compliance is becoming even more important. So our next slide just shows some topics related to why compliance is becoming ever increasingly important. So compliance was never really solely about the risk of non-compliance and the fear of fines and penalties, although this is still a powerful driver. And we're seeing that this risk is never going to go away. However, currently, in addition, regulatory compliance is still and always has been the foundation for resilient and responsible companies for a myriad of reasons. In their supply chains as a means of understanding the risk at the interfaces, as a means of accessing global markets by proving transparency and accountability, for eligibility for RFPs and tenders, for accessing investment and engaging with wider stakeholders, attracting and retaining employees, and of course, ultimately, reputation. Now, more than ever, the business case for compliance is apparent. In times of uncertainty, investors, partners, customers, consumers, and the wider market are looking to companies to show evidence of strong EHS regulatory compliance programs, to support the risk management and to show evidence of the resilience and ability to weather the storms both now and the future. So the next slide just shows a very short summary of the risks, rewards, and the whole topic of resilience built into understanding what the risks and rewards of regulatory compliance are. So really, in summary, an effective, robust and agile EHS regulatory compliance function should not be seen as a cost center. It is a commercial advantage shining a light through the stormy seas of uncertainty. And with that, I'm now going to hand over to Zain, who will share with us the findings from the Verdantix 2025 EHS Global Corporate Survey.
Thank you, Mary. So, yes, at Verdantix, we are a research and advisory firm, and our research goes across EHSQ, ESG, real estate and built environment, risk management, AI, and net zero. Today, and for my team, we focus on EHSQ, and in today's webinar, I'm going to be sharing some of the findings from the Global Corporate Survey, a survey that we conduct every year with over 300 EHS executives, asking them about their decision making, their budgets for the upcoming year, their investment plans, and some of their technological preferences. If you could move to the next slide. Thank you. So here, before we get going into the real crux of the survey, I think it's worth just outlining how we conducted it and the sort of processes we went through to get these findings. So here we have the method we used to conduct the survey. We conducted specifically 304 interviews with EHS decision makers via the phone, going through each question from the survey. Respondents were categorized into 24 industries, which were grouped into 4 risk categories: very high risk, medium risk, and low risk. This ranged from your oil and gas and chemicals firms in the very high risk category to retail and business service firms in the low risk sector. To ensure we captured a global audience of respondents, we selected companies from around the world. However, due to the market of the nature of EHS and the current market trends, there was still a large proportion of participants from North America and Europe. Interviews were conducted with company representatives at that sort of director level or above, and firms included had to achieve revenues of at least $250 million or above. This ensured that we captured the mid-market and enterprise level, the major buyers of EHS software. The main aim of this report is to understand how EHS functions budgets differ by region, by industry, by size, what their investment priorities are for the upcoming year, which technologies they're seeking to implement. And from these results, this can help software vendors really understand what corporate firms are seeking from the EHS solution and sort of help provide that. And from the corporate side, you can see where your peers, where they're investing, what their goals are, and what their sort of long-term vision is for the next year. If you could move to the next slide, please. Cool. So now we're getting to sort of the major findings that we got and some of the questions and answers from the survey. So up here, we have a question about how important the following operational goals were for EHS functions over the next 2 years. Regulatory compliance, in particular, is a fundamental aspect of EHS, and alongside reducing serious injuries and fatalities, complying with regulation around environmental metrics and employee health are some of the major reasons to have an EHS business function in the first place. As a result, regulatory compliance has been seen as a key operational goal for a number of years, alongside reducing SIFs. However, new trends see the rise in a number of new goals and priorities. This can include, say, total worker health, contractor management, and even ESG and sustainability. However, despite these trends, regulatory compliance remains as a key goal. We asked respondents in the Global Corporate Survey about how important these operational goals are for the next 2 years. And from the figure, we can see that improving the monitoring of EHSQ regulatory change to ensure compliance was the third most important goal. Specifically, 51% of respondents considered this to be either the most important goal or very important. Although it is a traditional EHS goal, it is also worth noting that there's been significant regulatory change in the past few years, especially around environmental initiatives driven by things like ESG and sustainability, an influx of chemical and product compliance regulation, and also just a general trend of firm responsibility of their workers to ensure that they're both healthy and happy. We could move on to the next slide, please. Nice. So in the previous slide, we highlighted that regulation has been changing over the past few years. So on this slide, we're going to break down some of the changes that we have seen in the past few years within the EHSQ sphere. The figure breaks down these regulatory changes into the various regions we have seen. On the top left, we have North America, which in 2023 implemented regulation around PFAS, known as polyfluoroalkyl substances, sorry about that, which are man-made chemicals used in various products as they can repel heat, water, and grease. However, they struggle to be broken down by the surrounding environment, often finding their way into bodies of water before being consumed by humans and animals. Regulation implemented around the maximum containment level in drinking water was issued under Biden's administration. However, since Trump's administration in the US, they will be reducing the number of PFAS substances that will be monitoring in drinking water, as well as extending the implementation of the regulation to 2031. Now, despite this U-turn in the US, there are other regions across the globe that have recognized the importance of reducing human consumption of PFAS, with regulation implemented in the EU and Australia, alongside chemical controls introduced in Singapore and hazardous substance limits in New Zealand. Aside from chemical regulation, the EU has seen several sustainability-based regulations, ESG regulations such as CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which requires firms to disclose detailed information on their ESG impacts, and CSDDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which requires large companies to identify, prevent, and mitigate adverse human rights and environmental impacts with operations. However, in February 2025, the EU Omnibus was introduced, which was a package of proposed regulatory changes to streamline existing EU legislation. This included simplifying reporting requirements, such as CSRD, to only large companies and streamlining CSDDD to focus on Tier 1 suppliers, unless there is further information around adverse impact further down the supply chain. Although these are ESG regulations, ESG functions support them by aggregating environmental data, such as greenhouse gas emissions, which are then used for reporting. This figure shows how regulation is changing across the globe with an increased focus around sustainability and chemical compliance. And with EHS functions software and ability to record this vast amounts of this data quite easily, it serves as a great purpose and assister for ESG functions to record this data and meet some of the regulatory goals. You can move on to the next slide. Nice. So as complying with regulation is seen as a priority for EHS functions, it can be used as a reason for more investment in technology that can help achieve these goals. This figure captures what the main drivers of EHS technology investment are. Regulatory decrease or increase has come out on top as the most important. Specifically, 31% of respondents consider it to be the most important factor, with a further 34% considering it to be very important. In the past, it has often been the case that EHS functions fail to receive significant investment compared to some of the other business functions, such as finance or HR. EHS functions tend to come to the forefront when a serious incident has occurred, whether this in extreme cases be a fatality or a serious incident. This is usually an internal issue, but when it comes to external factors, regulation is the main driver. Failure to meet regulation can create a whole host of issues, ranging from basic financial penalties to later on disruptions to productivity and potential harm to brand reputation, which we will go into in more detail on the next slide. So to help break down the various consequences of failing to comply with EHS regulation, I've produced a figure with 3 key subheadings which these consequences fall into. The first is legal and financial, then operational and reputational, and last we have regulatory action. Under the legal and financial consequences, we have financial penalties. Regulatory bodies can issue significant fines for failing to meet compliance standards. Depending upon the severity of the violation, the financial penalties could indeed be large, and this can impact budgets and future spending. There's also the issue of disqualification, where workers that are responsible cannot return to their job. And last, here we have personal lawsuits, where injured employees seek compensation. With cases such as disqualification, that would involve maybe hiring new workers, which can then have a whole issue of having to train them up to the standard that the company upholds. So not only is there an effect in terms of the financial side of things, where you will be set back in terms of spending and future budget allocation, there's also the long-term strategy issue. Moving on to the middle column, we have operational and reputational consequences. First, we have serious injuries and fatalities, probably the most obvious and severe consequence. Next, we have reputational damage. Severe violations can often make press releases where the wider public are aware of the incident that's occurred. This may discourage other companies and people from working or buying the product they produce in the future, ultimately impacting their business opportunities. Next, we have disruptions to operations, where violations can cause potential halts in production and take a while to get going to the levels that were seen pre-incident. This ultimately reduces productivity, impacting business performance. And last in this section, we have decreased morale and productivity. After a major incident has occurred, there could be a lack of trust amongst workers, anxiety around their job security following the impact of the incident and safety, and a general disconnect between the values of the organization that it says it abides by and the actual practices. In the last column, we have regulatory action, which includes further inspections and investigations from regulatory bodies to identify any other issues which might be present. Next, we have improvement or prohibition notices, where the regulatory body outlines specific regulations that have been breached and the steps that they must take to become compliant. And last, we have public announcements through registers, court proceedings, and regulatory investigations, which can ultimately harm business reputation and future opportunities. I think it's worth noting that with these 3 overarching holistic topics, that it's not just fines that cause failing to comply. It's not just maybe lawsuits. It can lead to things more serious. It can lead to a more serious incident, which can result in severe injuries, fatalities, destruction of the work site. And this can lead to, as well, further penalties, but also disruptions to the production, further lack of further investment opportunities, further investigation, harms to your potential brand. So I think it's worth taking into consideration when you look at compliance, that it's not just a mere tick box exercise, which a lot of firms and a lot of people tend to view it. It's only till something goes wrong and the consequences can be quite severe that you think, oh, I should have taken note of that and sort of abide by the rules. And that's why it's key with EHS functions to create that sort of positive safety culture, which we often hear about, where where workers understand their role, understand the importance of safety to both themselves and the wider organization. And they're more likely to abide by safety best practices to prevent something like a violation of regulation occurring. Moving on to the next slide, please. So this question from the survey focuses on how spending will change in 2026 compared with 2025. And as we can see, environmental initiatives with a strong emphasis on regulatory compliance have dominated. ESG and sustainability has come out on top, and it was also first in last year's edition of the Global Corporate Survey. Other categories that have also scored high here include greenhouse gas monitoring and environmental compliance, both of which can be used for meeting ESG legislation. This goes back to the point that I made earlier in the webinar, that EHS functions are providing support for ESG teams through data tracking and management of environmental metrics. It's also worth noting that these regulatory-based initiatives will receive greater spending than some of the more traditional aspects of EHS, such as safety, incident management, and risk management. This could be the case because EHS functions already have digital software in place for these modules, and new investment is driven by sustainability initiatives. But it also emphasizes the importance of regulation and the importance that EHS functions have to ESG. Although firms now have dedicated ESG teams, which a few years ago they didn't necessarily have, and the EHS function will take that on. EHS has that sort of dedicated role to play for ESG teams. And you can see this on the software side. A lot of the EHS software firms out there in the last few years have really extended their software capabilities with regards to the E aspect, where a lot of them originally came out of the safety side or health side. Their environmental capabilities have really taken off. And it's with them that ESG functions can really use those capabilities when it comes to meeting regulation, tracking various metrics, and seeing how their performance lines up against regulatory standards. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Cool. So we should have a poll question coming up. Correct me if I'm wrong. Nice. So this question, just a poll question for you guys, an opportunity for you guys to sort of interact with us as presenters of the webinar. So the question is, in which of the following categories does your firm plan to allocate the greatest spending increase over the next year? So the options we have are ESG and sustainability, EHS training, learning and development, environmental compliance, greenhouse gas monitoring, incident management, and occupational health, safety hazards, and risk mitigation. So I've already seen people start to answer the poll. So if we could have another, say, 30 seconds, there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. It's just really for us to understand as attendees of the webinar, do you align with some of the stuff we've seen, and how you measure up to some of your peers. Just give another 10 seconds for anyone. Nice. So looking at the results of the poll question, we can see that, yeah, it's ESG and sustainability that will dominate increase in spend over the next year, which is exactly what we saw in the Global Corporate Survey that we conducted ourselves. Other categories that were high looks like it was safety and hazards and risk mitigation. So it's interesting there, sort of what we alluded to earlier in the presentation, that there's that mixture of, say, some of the more traditional aspects being spent and some of the more areas which before went above and beyond EHS, but more recently ESG now a fundamental aspect for EHS functions. So moving on to with the slides. After speaking about chemical compliance earlier on, when we looked at some of the regulation that was taking place across Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and the EU, it'll be interesting to see what particular challenges are really impacting EHS functions. Chemical compliance is a major aspect of compliance for many EHS teams, where ESG might be more recent and there's been a significant uptick. Chemical compliance has been very much a part of their goals for a number of years now. And with the sort of nature that a lot of high-risk EHS, high-risk industries operate in, they use chemicals and very dangerous substances on a regular basis. So chemical and product compliance challenges are always an issue. So this question taken from the survey asks how important some of the chemical and product compliance challenges are. You can see the impact of Trump's administration's halt of PFAS regulation here, where it was seen as the least important challenge. Previously, in last year's edition of the survey, we asked the same question, and it was in the middle, in fact, third place. So quite a difference from last year. However, we see the impact of chemical regulations in general across the globe is clear, with tracking chemical regulation seen as the third most important challenge, with 50% of respondents considering it to be either the most important challenge or a very important challenge. It's also worth noting that the most important challenge here is eradicating and substituting potentially hazardous substances. It's received a significantly large proportion of respondents that considered it to be the most important challenge, double the option which is finished second, which is maintaining an up-to-date library of safety data sheets. This could be down to increased regulation, but also just a growing conscience by firms and people alike around the impact that their operations have to the wider environment and not just their business performance. Regulations are good there to put in place and help firms sort of as a best practice, help guide firms on how to operate sustainably and efficiently. However, I think with the growing impact of ESG and sustainability within a the corporate world, but also with regards to sustainability and more environmental sort of lifestyle, I think people are more conscious of the impact that they have at their job in their daily life to the environment and the impact that their actions have. And I think this is sort of being reflected in some of the scores here. Firms are aware of some of the issues that using these hazardous substances can cause in the short term, maybe illnesses could arise or serious incidents, but also in the long term and the wider impact it has to society. Moving on. Nice. So in this last slide, we're going to discuss AI. Obviously, it's a hot topic and one of them that we asked in the Global Corporate Survey, and specifically tailor our findings from AI to the impact it has on regulation and regulatory compliance. AI can help transform firms' approach to EHS by streamlining current processes and providing predictive analytics that can help to be used in decision making. However, to ensure the successful implementation of AI solutions, there are several hurdles which people must address. One major hurdle is a lack of budget allocation and prioritization of AI. This could be down to the fact that EHS AI solutions are still quite new and not entirely proven yet. Once there are clear examples of success stories and use cases which demonstrate clear benefits, will it encourage more firms to invest? With regards to regulatory compliance, there are some solutions out there. One of the key things being used are sort of web scraping tools, where some software vendors have solutions that sort of scour scientific journals to see when the latest regulatory updates will occur. Other cases can be utilizing AI to scan regulatory documents. These documents can often be quite hefty, quite long, difficult to interpret. And what they do is they sort of scan and sort of tag through sort of tagging technology, identify the regulation that is specific to that company, that industry, and that region that they operate in. And through this, they can then produce summaries on regulation in like a clear, condensed manner, which is easy to understand, easy to digest. So not only are you seeing the regulation that's applicable to you, you're understanding what it is, how it will impact you, and this can help with further strategy and planning. Where do you put your money in for the future? Where do you invest? How do you change your operations and priorities to align with this regulation? However, there are some, when it comes to some of the barriers, as already highlighted, there are also some internal factors to consider. One issue is that EHS data is currently not up to scratch. Data can be unstructured or still in paper or Excel spreadsheets. To use AI effectively, data needs to be organized in a structured manner and be accurate in order to give the correct assessments and predictions. Using AI for EHS can be dangerous if it's used wrongly, leading to decisions that could place workers in severe danger. Another factor is that firms' current technology stack may not be able to support AI. Issues with technology stack is something seen across EHS. Sometimes firms struggle to integrate with various point solutions, which can often lead to data silos. And when it's selecting a new software or migrating processes over, that's one of the main issues when whether it's integrating with other software systems not based EHS based, or even if it's integrating with another point solution to cover another aspect. To use AI effectively, you have to have the correct data in place and the correct technology. And the last point to mention is that there's some safety concerns around AI. EHS functions have access to personal data, and there has been a rise in cyber attacks where this kind of information can be exposed to the wrong parties. There must be security measures placed on this data and even limit what data is allowed to expose to AI to prevent these instances from occurring. So I think if we move on to the next slide. Nice. So excellent. I think that's my section over. Hand back to Jill.
Thank you so much, Zane. This was extremely informative, and we're going to come back to yourself and Mary in just a moment for our QA panel. And I would remind our audience to please drop your questions for Zane and Mary into the Q&A window, and we'll work on addressing them and hearing the discussion as a group. First, I wanted to share a little bit of the findings ANHISA has from survey of our own clients. This was done by a major multinational firm, research firm, independent research firm, and it was about 300 surveys and 100 in-person interviews with research uncovering from left to right here, increased effectiveness of the compliance team using EHS intelligence and compliance intelligence data, with more time to focus on execution and not just monitoring and searching for that data. So more effective EHS teams by 15 to 20%, 25 to 30% cost savings from consolidating the many numerous solutions across the world into one source of truth for every global jurisdiction, and reduced total cost of compliance by about 10%, including the frequency and severity of regulatory breaches, and that would kind of cost savings would reflect fines, non-compliance issues, legal liabilities, time lost, in addition to audits and insurance costs compiled in that figure. And finally, increased trust from stakeholders. So the transparency that Zane and Mary were speaking to, where 100% of senior stakeholders reported feeling empowered and reassured from using NHISA and having direct access to data about the regulatory requirements and compliance standing in relation to those requirements. So our next step right before the panel to inform our panelists will be our final poll of the session to learn where you stand in terms of what weighs your team's EHS investment decisions most heavily. So would you say they're weighed the most by the impact of AI and looking into the future in making those investment decisions? Would you say sustainability is a driver? Would you say keeping up with the pace of regulatory change is the most important one? Or demonstrating the value of EHS investment? I found that note about EHS kind of being crowded out by other organizational priorities to be very interesting and eye-opening as Zane was speaking. Or would you say it's the pressure from external teams, shareholders, investors, and customers? So I'll give you a few more minutes to fill these out and we can look at one another's reported findings here and see. Looks like AI's on the low end. Please continue clicking if you haven't yet. Sustainability, growing in importance. Keeping up with the pace of regulatory change, definitely pulling ahead with our attendees today. Close followed by ROI. We appreciate that, everyone needing to build that business case to demonstrate the strategic importance of EHS, which we'll be getting to in our panel discussion. And finally, those external pressures. Excellent. Thank you so much for that. We can move on from the poll, and I'd love to open again up the Q&A to anyone in the audience who'd like to jump in. I'll start with a few questions for our panelists, and then I'd like you to take over. So please drop your Q&A into the window. We'll have Mary and Zane back to begin answering. And I think when we discussed this panel, we talked about how we could kind of put a human face on some of the research and regulatory changes that we shared. So we're going to start with you, Zane. And in terms of the artificial intelligence topic that that you just shared, with technology evolving so quickly, this could be for buying teams or operating teams, folks that have to get in and do the day-to-day. How do you see that evolution of AI really impacting people in these positions? Is there a lot of trust there? Is there a lot of trepidation still? Are they embracing AI and rolling it out, or is there still a means of like, let's create a barrier and make sure this is real safe before we move forward? So that question to Zane, if you could hear me.
I would say,
Thanks.
from my perspective, it's I think a lot of we see in sort of general commercial use, AI has really taken off. I think with businesses, I think there's always trepidation. One of the things I alluded to earlier with AI is if you have sort of unstructured data, issues with your own technology stack, that can limit your use of AI to begin with. And when it comes to things like regulatory compliance, you know, if making mistakes can be really impactful. We've already know that EHS functions are dealing with very high risk industries, and failure to making mistakes, failure to adhere to best practices can sometimes be fatal, can be really serious. So if you are using AI, you need to be 100% sure that what you're getting is accurate, that you trust in it, even check back through what its findings to ensure that it matches with data. So I think there's definitely scope and there's definitely opportunity for AI to prosper within EHS, within the regulatory sphere. But with doing that, it's very important that firms are 100% confident that their own data and their own sort of technology is both accurate and suitable before taking on these findings.
Thank you. And Mary, how do you see AI unfolding within HESA's own customers' sort of use of the technology and trust in the technology?
Well, I think really to echo Zane's comments, a lot of it depends on, it's a tool. What are you going to use that tool for? And, again, back to a comment that he made earlier, the data that you're going to use, it's got to be good data. So I think, as part of the whole AI discussion, now is a really good time to start thinking about housekeeping. So what information do you want to use? Is that information in a usable? Is it quality data? Because what we do know is both EHS and sustainability related topics generate huge amounts of data. So any tool that you can have to help you get the best benefit. And I think it's back to what do you want out of it? Everybody says AI is this panacea, AI will fix everything. It's what do you actually want it to do before these are like fundamental questions before you make that investment. We know that we're using it more and more, in our own business here and in HESA. But it's still very much, a tool to be used in addition to our human analysts. So for every company, you might have a different proportion of, AI to humans. But I think you got to realize you're going to need both. But it's all driven by what are your objectives?
Excellent. Think of those objectives first. And I know we always call it human in the loop, keeping a human at the front line of reviewing and curating and checking. And we have an AI team in HESA, so fine tuning those results to be sure they're sticking to the expert guidance and the legal guidance that experts would also give, and not sort of letting it stray outside those guardrails and boundaries. So that's a really important topic. Again, probably one we could discuss for an entire webinar. Great. Mary, you mentioned sustainability, and I know your role crosses both teams. Zine, you also mentioned sustainability. We'll begin the question on sustainability with Mary. You shared, Mary, how global trends are impacting sustainability and EHS programs. How do you see customers of HESA either integrating those programs, drawing the line between them, or understanding the overlap and the interaction between them?
Well, again, I think we're very much aligned with the findings that Zane shared with us. EHS compliance, regulatory compliance information is probably the key element of a good foundation for any, sustainability related disclosure reporting, identification of objectives, looking at your materiality assessments, EHS compliance information. You already have, or most companies are already going to have, 20, 30, 40 years worth of data, captured, throughout the business. And now, as Zane says, a lot of that might be still in Excel spreadsheets, so the first thing to do really is to make sure that it's back to good housekeeping. Once you've carried out your materiality assessment, which is identifying those topics which are material to your business, carrying out your housekeeping then to make sure there are no gaps in your regulatory compliance and, in any parts of the business, because that's going to be the foundation you rely on for your reporting. Now, when CSRD and the associated reporting standards were first published, our analysts actually did a comparison of EHS topics that companies would typically be capturing compliance data on and the data points in the ESRS. And we found that there was, close to an 80% overlap just on the environment side and over 40% overlap on the health and safety side. So already there's some really, really good information embedded in companies. Now, one of the things, and I think Zane again referred to it earlier, was the data silos. What we're seeing is that companies, internal collaboration is still a bit of a challenge for some companies. I think they're getting better, but whether it's finance that's leading the reporting side, whether there's a sustainability team looking at objectives and targets, EHS has got to have a key role at that table, because the fundamental information that they already have at their fingertips is there ready to be used for the sustainability reporting. So I think the overlap is obvious.
Excellent. Zane, would you be able to jump in and talk a little about that overlap and how you see companies realizing this across their teams, how the teams are constructed from your vantage point in the interplay of EHS and ESG?
Definitely. I think when ESG regulation first really started to take off, a lot of companies weren't necessarily ready for this. They had EHS teams, but not necessarily an ESG team. And originally EHS functions would handle a lot of the responsibility for ESG teams, simply because of that overlap we said, especially for the environmental side, when it comes to recording things such as greenhouse gas emissions, air emissions, hazardous waste, water and wastewater. There's significant overlap there. And EHS teams, not only did they record this, but they had the software tools and hardware tools, IoT devices that can help record this information in real time, be able to put it on a software that you could easily analyze, interpret, compare it across your organization, whether it be on your site, whether it be across the entire organization, and assess it against regulation. So having this information there, having these tools there that can do this is fantastic for ESG teams. And that's, I suppose, the big overlap we see. Aside from maybe the environmental side, there's also the growing conscious, especially in the health of the mental health and digital mental well-being that we see in EHS. And I suppose overlap with ESG would be from the social side, looking at your individual workers. There's all well and good having workers that are productive, but we know now the impact that mental health has, not only from your home life that it has on your job, but also how your job impacts your own mental state and the impact that that can have on productivity. If you're not well, if you're struggling at work, then this can impact your performance. And it can also, with regards to EHS, it can lead to maybe some more safety incidents occurring, lapses in concentration, failure to meet sort of certain standards or best practices, which can lead to a serious incident. They can lead to a violation of regulation. So with that in mind, it's really important to be able to monitor your workforce, ensure that they are both healthy and happy in their role. And if there are any issues with that, to pick that up. So I think from that side, the environmental side and the health side, I suppose they are two massive areas where there's been significant overlap. And I think moving forward with that sort of ESG focused mind, that sustainability focused mind, that's only going to grow more.
Excellent, thank you. And I was really struck, Zane, when you mentioned about the personal side that we bring to roles in EHS and ESG, and taking a personal accountability that extends into work. And I thought our last question could be about the deregulation that both of you spoke to, and those trends in changing regulations so quickly, sometimes growing, sometimes less so. But what are the other drivers outside of regulation that you see the most? And is there this aspect of social responsibility, this accountability to investors, customers, and the community? And where does that fall in the importance as regulations sort of change and morph, if you will? Do you want to start on that one, Zane? And we'll direct it to Mary after that.
Yeah, sure. I think obviously, as we discussed, regulation is one of the traditional goals of EHS, and one of the other goals is reducing serious injuries and fatalities. We discussed if something like that occurs in your organization, aside from the regulatory impacts, whether it's with regards to your brand, whether it's financial, whether it comes to productivity and strategy, there's a whole host of issues that will impact your organization. So you have those other traditional goals and wanting to reduce injuries, incidents from occurring. Aside from that, I'd say kind of that social responsibility that we said, there's that growing conscience to ensure that workers are safe. Well-being is exhibited across your organization. You don't really want to be working somewhere where you don't feel valued, where you feel that you're just a cog in the machine. You want to really feel sort of a sense of belonging. And I think from that if you have a strong adherence to safety across the organization, and you're sort of protected in that sense, that you know that your job, you will be safe, and you've taken the right protocol to ensure that, both yourself and your peers and the firm itself, then you're happy, you're more likely to be productive, you're more likely to stay with the organization. So I think that there's that social responsibility and that growing conscious to make sure that workers are healthy and well.
And Mary, a few words in closing on other drivers besides regulation.
Yeah, sure. I think, as we've both said, the regulatory driver is still hugely important. But also increasingly important, you're seeing more and more, as Zane mentioned, the attraction and retention of employees, is very much based on a company's values, its purpose, its culture, how it does business, how it's seen to do business. And that goes all the way through the stakeholder ecosystem, how you manage your supply chain. And obviously, what happens in your supply chain does reflect on you. So being able to, transmit and make sure that your corporate values are reflected in your suppliers is becoming more and more important. We talked a lot about the markets and investors. Investors are still looking for standardized, usable investment grade data. And even if the regulation is not driving you to do these things, maybe, in this period of, we talked about uncertainty, the markets, the investors, the consumers, the stakeholders, the employees, everybody else is pushing harder and harder to make sure that companies do their business in a responsible manner. Now, at the same time, companies that do that are usually those that are the more resilient companies. They have good, strong structures in place. But I think, what we need to do is it's two-pronged. Make sure you understand where the regulations are coming from. So having that look on the horizon to see what's coming next, understanding the requirements of your wider stakeholder ecosystem, and making sure that you have the processes and structures in place to meet those requirements.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. We are certainly coming up on time, and we would invite anyone attending today to please join our next webinar on the forward-looking trends in ESG, very relevant topic for a lot of you as you're responding, as well as relevant to Verdantix's research. Please look into Enhesa. We offer the agility and resilience that Mary was speaking to through confidence in your EHS data, traceable and harmonized back to the requirements to understand where your teams stand globally around the world, adding that efficiency to their work so they're not constantly searching for data, but can really apply action and strategy with that data, building institutional resilience and reducing risk to get more strategic, to give EHS a seat at the table in those really key decisions that are impacted by your compliance or could impact your compliance standing. And finally, we just invite you to go ahead and scan and see our next webinar if you want to jump in. It's on EHS and ESG. Submit any questions before you leave, but please join us the next time. We'll see you again in October. And many thanks again to Mary and Zane, especially Zane as our guest speaker from Verdantix. We so appreciate your time. Take a moment to fill out the survey, please, as you leave. And if you'd like outreach from Mary, Zane, and Enhesa, or anyone you heard from today on the call, just drop us a note and let us know. I appreciate the applause. Thanks so much, guys, for your time. Everyone have a wonderful day, and we will see you the next time.